Chapter 11, Abnormal States. Quote, "You must always be puzzled by mental illness. The thing I would dread most if I became mentally ill would be your adopting a common sense attitude, that you could take it for granted that I was deluded." Ludwig Wittgenstein. It is commonplace to hear that creative genius is akin to or linked to madness, but any consideration of brain diseases that led to impaired function, delusion, or hallucination will readily limit the truth of that statement. Abnormal states of consciousness, whether the result of drug, chronic degenerative brain disease, strokes, or the like, unlike creative efforts, do not usually require sophisticated normative standards for us to judge that they are unusual. Victims of neuropsychological syndromes have brain damage that is obviously causal of their symptoms. With psychoses, the issue of causation can be more subtle, and both the etiology and the pathogenesis of disease can be more obscure. Nonetheless, there is no mistaking the advanced delusional or hallucinatory state of a schizophrenic. And although matters can be more elusive in patients with bipolar disorders, their genuine reports of misery and slowed or manic behavior generally deviate from ordinary norms sufficiently to provide no diagnostic obstacles. With neuroses, however, the question of normative standards comes to the fore. Is unhappiness a neurotic symptom? Are neurotic persons simply suffering from extreme unhappiness? What can we say about these issues? I propose to consider how our account of brain function, consciousness, and the impact of science on human knowledge may shed light on the issues of abnormal mental states and vice versa. Given the vastness of this subject, I cannot go into great detail. I propose to consider neuropsychological syndromes first because they often illuminate aspects of normal brain function. Then I will briefly consider psychoses, particularly those that are, in one way or another, diseases of consciousness. Last, I will take up the challenging issue of neurosis. It is on the final set of examples that I wish to dwell, for their boundaries with normal behavior are often difficult to discern. The question I will address at that point is whether one may legitimately entertain or need a theory of neurosis. Obviously, this prompts thought of the predominant exponent of a wide-ranging theory of neurosis and of human personality, Sigmund Freud. Before launching into my thoughts on such matters, I had best set out my response to psychoanalytic theory. First, consider Freud's extraordinary accomplishments. Whatever one thinks of his sometimes exotic metaphors, Freud was the key expositor of the effects of unconscious processes on behavior. Furthermore, even if one rejects his characterization of personality structure, he provided clear descriptions and useful and innovative vocabularies for dealing with mechanisms of so-called ego defense. These are remarkable achievements. When, however, one considers his account of infantile sexuality, of the analysis of dreams, and of repression and memory, matters become harder to evaluate. Freud wove his ideas into a psychological theory that could be used to account for neurosis. Unfortunately, the so-called theory consisted mainly of a set of metaphors and was thereby untestable. As I pointed out earlier, metaphors, unlike similes, can be grasped but cannot be proved or disproved. The grand sweep of these metaphors was found to be attractive for matters of interpretation in the humanities, and this certainly contributed to the remarkable growth and permeation of Freud's proposals. Unfortunately, the biological grounds on which Freud based these proposals were ill-founded. An example is his reliance on Lamarckian notions and on the biogenetic law of Haeckel, which states that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Moreover, subsequent attempts to test the therapeutic effectiveness of psychoanalysis have been at best inconclusive and at worst unconvincing. To my mind, Freud's imagination was remarkable and in certain contexts even useful, but it did not give rise to scientific insight. His efforts nonetheless provoked the question that I plan to eventually address. Is a scientific theory of neurosis required or even possible? Approaches to answering this question have a bearing on the issue of reductionism that we have been considering all along. Before taking up these approaches, let me turn first to neuropsychology and organic brain disease. This will shed light on those aspects of brain-based epistemology concerned with illusions and the origins of belief. Neuropsychology as a descriptive discipline goes back to the beginnings of modern neuroscience. Classical examples are Broca's and Wernicke's aphasias. Damage to the motor association cortex extending to the so-called Broca's area leads to impairment of language production. Broca's patients can comprehend spoken language but have failures in language production and show defects in syntax and word order, so-called agrammatism. By contrast, patients with Wernicke's aphasia show major defects in language comprehension. The lesion is in the so-called Wernicke's area near the superior portion of the temporal lobe to which it often extends. Patients with this syndrome have empty speech, in which they fail to express their ideas. They often use the wrong word, paraphasia, or make up neologisms. Both Broca's and Wernicke's aphasias were described in the late 19th century and are classic examples of neuropsychological disorders. Modern research has revealed them to involve more than the cortical areas just described. Subcortical areas are often also implicated. Because of their historical priority, I mention them here as typical examples of functional alterations resulting from the brain damage that is often caused by stroke. Other examples include apraxias, disorders of movements, agnosias, failures to recognize objects despite the ability to see, hear, and so on, alexia, failure in reading skills, agraphia, failure in spelling or writing, dyslexias, difficulties in reading, amnesias, various types of memory loss, and prosopagnosia, failures to recognize faces. To one degree or another, these difficulties, and many others I have not mentioned, can be related more or less well to damage in specific brain areas or to failures in the embryonic development of certain parts of the brain. In the disorders I have mentioned, brain damage or disordered development clearly leads to certain alterations or losses of function. Each of the disorders I stress here involves a primary compensation, a delusional reaction, a confabulation, or a reconstruction of what undamaged persons would call reality. Sometimes these compensatory reactions are quite subtle and can go undetected. At other times they may appear bizarre. The reason I stress them here is twofold. We know they result from overt brain damage, and the reactions to that damage demonstrate quite clearly the constructive aspect of brain action in the face of severe loss. A striking example is seen in so-called disconnection syndromes. Most of these involve disruption of the corpus callosum, a commissure, a bundle of nerve tissues, consisting of hundreds of millions of axons interconnecting the two cerebral hemispheres. Rarely this commissure is not formed or is dissolved in certain genetic diseases. In some cases, patients with certain forms of epilepsy must undergo surgery that involves cutting the corpus callosum. The resulting syndrome has been masterfully studied by Roger Sperry. Although patients with commissurotomy can behave in certain circumstances in a fashion that appears normal, Sperry showed that there were distinct behavioral and cognitive differences that could be detected easily by having the patients stare at two screens, one for the right eye and the other for the left. The patient could then respond to commands either verbally or by pointing. As expected, verbal responses to pictures in the right visual field originated in the left hemisphere, but the right hemisphere could respond to an image in the left visual field only by pointing with the left hand. Indeed, in certain tasks of arranging blocks and patterns, the left hand, guided by the right hemisphere, performs somewhat better than the right hand. In one case, it appeared that a young patient retained the ability to respond to written queries by using the left hand to spell answers with the equivalent of Scrabble blocks. Asked about a favorite rock star, the patient using the left brain answered vocally. The left hand, however, spelled out a different name. From similar data, Sperry concluded that there were two consciousnesses at work, that of the everyday person dominated by speech originating in the left hemisphere, and that of a more limited type in the right. This has been disputed as a conclusion, but it has not been disproved. What could the origin of two conscious respondents in one body be? The extended theory of neural Darwinism would propose the hypothesis that there are two dynamic cores, each with capabilities that depend on the reentrant linkages constrained by the different target areas in the cortex. In any event, when the left hand performs in contrary fashion, the vocal patient confabulates or inverts a rationalization for any apparent contradiction. This has a bearing on epistemological issues in normal persons. It suggests that the brain of the conscious verbal individual must close a pattern or make sense at whatever cost. We will see similar phenomenon in the other psychological syndromes. There are other syndromes in which there is a loss of capability on one side of the brain. An example is the syndrome of hemineglect. which sometimes arises when the so-called right parietal cortex is strongly damaged by a stroke. The patient experiences and reports no vision in the left half of the visual field and behaves accordingly by shaving only on the right side or by reading a clock from 12 to 6, but not 6 to 12. More extreme strokes, which extend to include areas beyond the parietal on the right, can lead to the curious syndrome of anosognosia. The patient not only has neglect but is completely paralyzed on the left side, but patients with this syndrome deny being paralyzed. They can be intelligent, are capable of normal speech production and comprehension, and are generally not neurotic or psychotic. Nevertheless, they respond to potential contradictions about their performance, asserting that they moved when they didn't by confabulating. And when some months later they become aware of their paralysis, their memorial accounts of behavior during anosognosia period also are confabulations. Once again, it appears that the brain-body interaction, combined with past learning, results in apparently delusional accounts in which self-consistency is more pertinent than the reports of normal witnesses. Similarly, in a disease called Anton syndrome, patients who are physiologically and behaviorally blind assert that they can see. Somewhat related, perhaps, are cases of blindsight in which a patient who is cortically blind in some expanse of the visual field can nonetheless make correct decisions when asked to guess about the identity of figures presented in that blind portion of the field. Certain aspects of previously learned responses can also be seen in patients with prosopagnosia. These patients may not consciously recognize their spouse's face, but in a test of pictures containing that face will make positive recognitions in an implicit manner. Sometimes the conviction of a patient can seem to be truly bizarre. In Capgras syndrome, for example, some patients show so-called reduplicative paramnesia, in which the patient will claim, for example, that his or her mother is in fact not the real mother, but is instead an imposter. I could go on to point out that an epileptic attack in the temporal lobe can result in a patient's conviction that he or she has previously been in a place that is clearly new, déjà vu, or has had a distinct set of thoughts before, déjà pensé. I hope that the examples I have described so far make it clear that the brain-body relationship is critical in the acquisition of knowledge and belief. Most of these syndromes represent diseases of consciousness or attention. Perhaps most important is that the symptoms are not primarily due to early psychic trauma, nor are the patients psychotic. In some cases, however, psychiatric illness can mimic such symptoms. Attempts to account for the confabulation in these syndromes have called on damage to the so-called orbitofrontal cortex. Patients in whom this brain area is damaged or isolated from other connections often show a lack of responsible behavior or an inability to plan actions. Similarly, the so-called mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus has been associated with spontaneous confabulation. The hypothesis has been advanced that these two brain areas, among others, are necessary for monitoring thoughts that are inappropriate, and when they fail to function, confabulation ensues. What is missing from this hypothesis is an explanation in terms of the interactions of these brain areas with the rest of the brain. The key conclusion for our purposes is that even though the detailed pathogenesis of most of these syndromes has not been fully accounted for, no theory beyond a global theory like neural Darwinism appears necessary for their explanation. Of course, a fascinating challenge remains, when certain brain areas are damaged, to account for how a selectional brain with reentrant thalamocortical interactions responds in the particular way that it does in terms of behavior and beliefs. A rich source of investigation may be to explore whether reentrant interactions are grossly altered in these diseases, so that reentry among the residual cortical areas may be called on to compensate for loss. The challenge is, if anything, even greater for another set of abnormal cases, the psychoses. Psychoses are diseases in which there is severe impairment of the ability to function in everyday life and to stay in contact with reality. These diseases are especially challenging to our efforts to understand etiology and pathogenesis, for although there is evidence of neural and chemical disorder, there is usually no gross evidence of brain damage. Exceptions exist in cases of toxic psychosis, for example, Korsakoff psychosis and extreme alcoholism, in diseases such as tertiary syphilis, as well as in dementias such as Alzheimer's disease. But often it is difficult to identify a specific lesion. In the most polymorphous of psychotic diseases, schizophrenia, for example, There is definite evidence for a polygenic mutational origin, but there are also indications of complex environmental contributions, the details of which are hard to disentangle. Patients with schizophrenia show a variety of florid symptoms. These include third person auditory hallucinations, ideas of reference and influence, and delusions of control by alien forces. These symptoms are often accompanied by emotional blunting and poor interpersonal rapport. In bipolar disease, a severe mood disorder, there is evidence for a pharmacological imbalance that results as the remarkable slowing of behavioral responses in the conscious depression seen in full-fledged cases. But even given the entire history, it is difficult to attribute the origin of the symptoms to the environment alone. As in the neuropsychological disorders, the suspicion is that no theory of personality is required specifically to account for these abnormal states. Instead, one must identify alterations in brain mechanisms and relate them to scientific hypotheses about brain action. For example, could the hallucinatory and delusional symptoms of schizophrenia be the result of distortions in reentrant timing among higher order core areas and non-conscious brain regions? If certain temporal delays in linking core responses arose as the result of physiological or microanatomical disturbances, it is conceivable that a patient might confuse his or her own thoughts for exterior voices or for malign references from without. Whatever the case, pathogenic explanations of the abnormal symptoms of psychosis do not appear to need an elaborate or all-encompassing theory of personality. Do we need such a theory at all? In asking this question, we arrive at the most challenging set of syndromes, grouped rightly or wrongly under the designation neuroses. It was to the understanding of this domain that Freud's major efforts were directed. Before 1980, neuroses were described as a broad set of diseases, relatively mild as compared to psychoses, without loss of contact with reality. In 1980, in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-3, American Psychiatric Association eliminated this broad distinction and instead described each disease or syndrome in its own terms. Neuroses include a number of symptom complexes. Anxiety disorders include anxiety neurosis, phobic neurosis, and obsessive-compulsive neurosis. Hysterical neuroses are categorized under somatoform disorder, comprising conversion hysteria, hypochondriasis, and somatization disorder, and also under dissociative disorder, which covers dissociative hysteria, psychogenic amnesia and fugue states, multiple personality, and depersonalization neurosis. In phobic neurosis, exaggerated fears of events, objects, and bodily functions are seen, none of which is inherently dangerous. Patients show extreme anxiety attached to stimuli from these sources. Specific examples include agoraphobia, fear of public spaces, acrophobia, fear of heights, and claustrophobia, fear of closed spaces. In obsessive-compulsive disorder, there are recurrent fantasies, obsessions, or actions, compulsions, of which the patient is aware and often tries to resist, but to no avail. There is a bizarre recurrence of notions that the patient cannot avoid, for example, that every third word is dirty, forcing repetitive covering of the mouth with one hand. The patient knows that this is magical thinking, and thus his or her testing of reality is intact. In hysterical neuroses, one sees conversion symptoms such as apparent paralysis of certain muscle groups or limbs. In yet others there are complaints of blindness or deafness. In other cases, one may observe disassociation, the loss to conscious awareness of perceptions and memories. This may result in amnesia or in fugue, the loss of identity and recollection of the patient's past life. In somatization disorders, various vague bodily complaints such as headaches, nausea, and the like are present in the absence of actual organic dysfunction. This syndrome can be distinguished from hypochondriasis, in which the patient is convinced that he or she is suffering from a serious disease. This is no place to detail the rich and extensive proposals that Freud put forth to explain neuroses. According to the ideas underlying psychoanalysis, neurotic symptoms result from inner conflicts. The causes of these conflicts often arose in early childhood from the frustration of infantile sexual drives. The basic postulate of psychoanalysis was incorporated in the notion of a dynamic unconscious mind. In neuroses, a variety of defense mechanisms operate to keep conflicts from conscious recall. Working to achieve conscious recognition of repressed memories became a main aim of psychoanalytic therapy. Underlying these ideas was an account of the triune structure of human personality consisting of the id, superego, and ego. The id was considered to be a deep domain of the unconscious concerned with the gratification of instinctual drives. The superego was considered to be the result of parental and societal forces acting to censor or repress urges originating in the id. Finally, there was the ego, which mediated between the id and the superego in confronting reality. The ego was in large measure identified with conscious awareness. One of the challenges faced by psychoanalysts was to make the repressed conflicts leading to neurosis available to the conscious mind. Where id was, there ego shall be. Freud proposed that dreams were reflections of covert wish fulfillments. Along with the method of free association applied during therapy, dreams were considered to be the royal road to the unconscious. In its grand formulation of personality structure, unconscious conflict under repression, and its theory of sexuality, Freud's psychoanalytic edifice had a massive impact on psychology, social science, and literary studies. As I pointed out before, however, the theory failed to meet a number of criteria required for scientific verification. Freud's constructions, verifiable or not, touch on matters of a great import for brain-based epistemology. In the first place, they put great emphasis on symbolization. The mechanisms of ego defense provide a rich dissection of how an individual can avoid confrontation with threats to his or her notion of self. Moreover, the observation that knowledge and experience could be repressed suggested that conscious knowledge and belief were only a small fraction of the cognitive architecture of an individual. This and the fallacious use of suggestive metaphors provided one reason for the influence of Freud's ideas. Even if we reject certain of Freud's proposals as unscientific and psychoanalytic therapy as barely efficacious, one feature stands out. Psychoanalysis, above all other psychological practices, is concerned centrally with the history of the individual subject, with the individual's personal narrative, beliefs, and styles of thought. However laudable this effort, it prompts renewal of the question I addressed in considering neuropsychology and psychosis. Beyond a global brain theory is a theory of abnormal states, in this case a theory of neurosis, possible or even necessary? Could it not be that what is required is a dissection of the level of brain function of neural mechanisms related to consciousness, attention, automaticity in non-conscious brain areas, and the operation of value systems? I intend to answer the latter question in the affirmative. Attractive as Freudian metaphors may be, they are formulated in terms that are too removed from the structural mechanisms revealed by studies of brain-body interactions. Although it pays suitable attention to an individual's history, psychoanalysis attempts by means of a general theory to explain that history with all its individuality, irreversibility, and nonlinearity. We have seen how human history resists such general and reductive attempts. Individual history, it is true, differs from human history in the fact that the individual person may, in real time, render a report or record of his experience. But these, we have seen, are subject to a series of necessary illusions. Moreover, as we have seen in neuropsychological syndromes, the brain reacts to defects by filling in and confabulation. In these cases, at least, the problems cannot be laid at the door of psychosexual distortions. My remarks must not be taken as a rejection of psychotherapy, in the development of which Freud was a pioneer. Given what I have said about contingencies in the history of each individual's development and the ambiguities of language, scientific and causal efforts such as drug therapy need to be accompanied by interpersonal exchange. What we have seen from our brief review of neuropsychology, psychosis, and neurosis is the extraordinary range of causation and the response affecting different levels of brain structure. In neuropsychology, delusions can arise from gross destruction of brain areas. In psychosis, genetic and pharmacological alterations can result in massive distortions of reality testing. And in neuroses, functional connections between thoughts, beliefs, and value system responses can result in disturbed behavior. Here we come across problems relating to the trade-off between specificity and range in a selectional system. Early thought is largely metaphorical, and given its associative powers it can be useful, But if the tension between metaphors and higher order consciousness and normative values in a culture is given free rein, then it is perhaps not surprising that a rich variety of emotional states and symbolic displacements leading to symptoms can occur. If neural Darwinism is correct, then even in normal states, every perception is to some degree an act of creation, and every memory is to some degree an act of imagination. The degree is changed in psychiatric illness, and the challenge is to understand how and why. What about thought and thought processes? Here we may note with approval some of the ideas of Charles Saunders Peirce, the true founder of pragmatism. Peirce pointed out that sensations are immediately present to us as long as they last. He noted that other elements of conscious life, for example thoughts, are actions having a beginning, middle, and end, covering some portion of past or future. This fits our proposal that thought has an essential motoric component reflected in brain action but not in actual movement. Thought, Peirce said, is a thread of melody running through the succession of our sensations. In contrast, belief is something we are aware of that appeases the irritation of doubt that is the motive for thinking. Belief, he said, is a rule for action or a habit that provides both a resting place for thought and at the same time a starting point for further thought. What is needed to understand abnormal states, whether of thought or belief, will be afforded by the validation of a thoroughgoing brain theory such as neural Darwinism. But this is not enough. If we are to grasp the origins and development of abnormal states, we also must learn more about the specific brain mechanisms at all levels, as well as about language and higher order consciousness. This, and not a reductive theory of personality, has the potential for yielding a fuller grasp of mental pathology and a further understanding of brain-based epistemology.